Hi, welcome to our inaugural reading of our Some Favorite Writers series for this year. I've been teaching and reading Alice Elliott Dark for 30 years. She's the author of Naked to the Waist, a collection of short stories, and 2 novellas, Think of England, a novel, In the Gloaming, another collection of short stories, and her most recent novel, Fellowship Point. I used to have the pleasure of introducing her work to people. She used to be what was sort of thought of as a writer's writer. With this latest novel, she's become absolutely, I bet, now people tell me about Alice Elliott Dark and say, have you read? And I say, yes, I've been knowing about her for years. Joyce Carol Oates said of her stories that they're beautifully composed. Each story exudes the gravitas of a radically distilled novel. George Saunders says that her stories achieve in their style and beautiful detail a wonderful clarity. But this latest novel, which is not short, is an extraordinary achievement. The New York Times review said, my favorite paragraph in it said, "What first appears to be the story of 2 old ladies in Maine turns out to be a sophisticated inquiry into the course of female lives with time as an instrument of revelation, folding in and on itself, opening out, revealing the multi-layered histories of both Polly and Agnes as a means of showing a kind of existential truth." Well, I love that, but I also love, it's a great Tolstoyan adventure story about 2 old ladies. And you don't really get that. I mean, what other great novel is there about 2 old ladies? And so I just wanted to read a tiny bit from the very opening. I realized when I started this book, when I read the first page, I realized this was something I'd always wanted. It's a romance about old women having a fulfilling and meaningful and productive and happy life. Such a perfect day for writing, gray and quiet, but nothing came to her. Not a sentence, not a phrase, not a word worth keeping. Her wastebasket was full. Her pile of index cards was robust. Graph papers covered with diagrams, neatly pinned to a sheet of felt on the wall. But the spot where her stack of usable pages usually accumulated was an empty nest. This had never happened to her before. Agnes Lee had written 6 novels and dozens of books for children without hesitation, composing and rewriting and tossing, fearlessly killing her darlings, trusting many more would come along, not to mention volumes of journals and logs secreted in a captain's trunk in an attic room at the cottage, and lots of articles and essays under various witty pseudonyms. She might rewrite an entire manuscript, but she'd never before been at a loss at this juncture after her research had produced new material and the time had come to sit down and draft the book. Her writing was on tap. All she had to do usually was pull down the handle and out it flowed. That fact was at the center of her self-conception. She wrote. If she couldn't, if the trap was dry, then what? This sorry state, that was what. She was racing through barrels of rapidograph ink and wearing down a new pencil sharpener. Yet her book, her novel, the work that would round out a series written over decades, had garnered a usable word count of 0. All winter, she'd gotten nothing done. Agnes had lost hope for today, too, but her allotted writing time wasn't up yet, so she sat. Her rule was 5 hours, and damn it, she'd put in 5 hours. Habits filled in the fissures of an aging body and mind, and she couldn't afford to let them go. She'd seen her mother attempt to do a few sit-ups on her deathbed, and though Agnes felt little but a generic filial regard for that soulless snob, in that moment she hoped she'd be as disciplined as the last. She kept an inviolable schedule afforded by some inheritance and abetted by having had the vocation of writing for the last nearly 60 years. Rarely did she have to compromise for anyone, a privilege she did not take for granted and refused to squander. She was 80, but she had not slowed down, just the opposite. Her remaining work was urgent, and she was well aware of working alongside the specter of the unknown moment of her last breath. Since Mrs. Blunt had placed the mail by Agnes's place at lunch, and her perusal of several of the items had brought agitation into her controlled small world, she'd been particularly distracted. She paced her room and looked out the window and paced again. Here, welcome Alice Elliott Dark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona, and thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the Hammer Museum for having me in this beautiful space. I love California, and it's wonderful to be able to spend a little time here, especially sharing work, and I appreciate everybody coming out to hear a little bit. So, I'm going to read from the middle of the book. I don't think there's any spoiler material in this part because it's all happened in the past of the present story. There's a section in the middle of the book that's a journal that the character that Mona was just reading about, Agnes Lee, wrote in 1960 to 1962. She writes this journal in the form of a series of letters to her sister Elspeth, who's already dead. But when she starts writing the journal, she realizes that in order for her to think about what she wants to think about, she needs to direct her thoughts to somebody, to have like another consciousness with her in the journal space. So it sounds like she's talking to Elspeth, but Elspeth is no longer here. And a couple of other things I'm just going to mention. She's living at this point, she's 40 years old, she's living on Fellowship Point in Maine, which is a piece of land that has been passed down through generations of 5 different families. It was founded by her great-great-great-grandfather in the 1870s. And she's there alone in the winter. Nobody stays for the winter, but now that her family she has no reason to go back. So she's spending her first whole winter there. There's another young man and his small daughter living in a little cabin on the property. He's related to one of the owners of the larger cottages, but he's only been given use of this very inadequate space. So, and he's mysterious at this point. He doesn't talk much, he's rather gruff. And Agnes has taken to his little daughter, who's 3. When she meets the little daughter, the child has very little language because the father hasn't really engaged with her verbally for a lot of reasons. So anyway, we're going to see Agnes and we're going to see Nan in this scene. Again, it's 1960 and it's winter, and they're just up on this point pretty much alone. Dear Elspeth, children find a chink and creep in. This morning, even before I heard her footsteps, I sensed her coming. A vibration in the ether preceded her. The door opened and shut. I was practicing my drawing at the dining room table, pencils and paper spread out voluptuously. I continued working, but tracked her movements by sound through the rooms. She now has the confidence of the familiar and walks around the first floor as if she grew up here. I don't warn her, as I was so often admonished, against the possibility of hurting herself or breaking this or that. What does it matter if she breaks something, compared to her feeling as though she belongs? It was around 2 p.m. Our routine is drawing or playing a game, and then we have tea and cookies while I talk and she listens. I have been telling her about my life, my childhood, that is, school, pets, early books, our parents, you and Edmund, Polly and Teddy, the many rules we live by in Philadelphia, and the freedom of life here on the Point. I could be reading her Tolstoy and the result would be the same. She doesn't understand. Yet I was careful about what I said, as if she might, until today. Perhaps it was because she was in a pensive mood, or perhaps I was. In any case, I spilled the beans. "Come in," I called out. I kept working. Finally, she came into the dining room. I didn't look around. She placed her hand on my arm, a heavy, damp touch, rain falling. I turned around, feigning great surprise. "Is this a frog dressed as a girl?" I covered my eyes. She giggled, pulled my hands apart, stared at me, but when I didn't respond, pressed her nose to mine. "See me," she said. "Nan, is that you?" She cocked her head and widened her eyes. I love her scent. It's not nice or pretty. It's the odor of growth, like undergrowth, like dirt. "What are you doing today? Do you want to do some drawing with me?" I pushed a piece of paper her way and went back to my work. She put her hands on the edge of the seat and climbed up, first one knee and then the other, turned around and sat. I extended a pencil to her. I was trying to draw a campanula flower, purple cups holding shadows. To my right, a pencil sought a place in a child's hand. I slowed down and grasped my pencil in the triangular method I was taught. The other pencil got throttled near its tip. I pushed mine across the paper. This was imitated in a line that was slight on the outward foray, but more assured on the return. Nan worked very hard. We didn't speak, but her breaths are a vocabulary. When she's concentrating, her tongue moves across her bottom lip as if polishing it. The air in the back of her throat laps, tide-like. The quality of her application to the task is impressive, and I believe she has a high intelligence, but I don't know much about children. We spent another hour drawing, which seemed long time to me for a child to focus. When Nan laid her pencil down and slid out of her chair, Mrs. Circumstance made grilled cheeses and tomato soup. After we ate, we headed into the glass room for a postprandial stretch on the wicker sofa. Star was with us, dog, as always now. We walked around the room in a parade. Nan stopped to look at various objects and lingered over the family pictures on the center table. I named everyone for her, and she touched the faces. Then to the sofa, where Star thrust his head forward into Nan's lap, and she tapped his back. I began to speak without a plan and found myself back in the realm of the family pictures, as good a subject as any, and all the same to her. First, Edmund. A car accident. No real surprise to anyone. Such was his exuberance, his wildness, too often buoyed by Scotch. He didn't seem like a person who'd grow old, did he? He burned at too high a temperature to last a whole lifetime. He was the light soul in the house, the person who found humor behind every sofa cushion. Only Edmund was undeterred by our mother's austerity. He threw himself at her in every possible way, not so much determined to crack the facade, a mind welded to the society it came from, but to find the place he believed she must have saved for him when she decided to have children, that secret meadow or cove-side where his real mother roamed, ready to lie on the ground with him and tickle. We girls kept our silliness confined to our bedrooms or took it way outside, but he brought it into the living room in the form of jokes, limericks, mimicry, puns, impersonations, dances, and songs. He could imitate the voice and posture of anyone. He was ingenious, wasn't he? We laughed until our mirth stopped making sounds and our voices were twisted like dried apples, and we were sure we'd die from lack of air. Edmund studied our mother's face for signs of amusement. Any sign would do. If her lip twitched or her cheek bunched, he clapped his hands and threw his arms around her neck. "Mummy, you are a peach pie." And she'd throw back her head and laugh. We could never get that out of her. I don't know what would have become of Edmund had he grown older. He was getting tight too many evenings, acquiring an exhausted look in spite of his continued swirling energy. I tried to talk to him, but he made light of it, hugging me around the shoulders and assuring me he was finer than fine. I've always wondered about his accident, a single-car accident, they called it. Instantly dead, or so they told us. Who knows what that means? What fraction of a second of consciousness might be included in the word instant? If he had that fraction of time, what did he think of? I'd guess it was his days as a boy, when mischief wasn't deadly, but brought him love. Then you, Elspeth, you became sweeter and sweeter as you turned to Jesus more fervently, believing you understood him better, with every bite taken out of you by your disease. I'd walk into the room, and you'd tell me you were at Station 7 when Jesus falls for the second time. Imagine his pain, you'd whisper. This dramatic experience of Scripture wasn't part of our upbringing. Lachlan took us to meeting, that's their father, but our mother believed in both the notion of a supreme being and in the social importance of church and made us go with her. You are Episcopalian, she'd admonish us to correct our manners or wayward thoughts. We weren't, though. Lachlan put his foot down before we were confirmed in the Episcopal Church. Too many worthy people among those ranks, he said, worthy being just a shade away from unctuous or holier than thou. You were sorry, yearning for ritual and ceremony. Once again, I, for the 100th and 1000th time, was grateful that he protected and saved me so I could develop my soul myself. Elspeth, we were so close, but I never understood your spiritual life. You secretly wanted to become a priest and were crushed when you learned that women weren't allowed to. Doesn't that prove to you there's something wrong with the religion I goaded? It certainly does to me. You struggled with all the hypocrisies in religion. You were too smart to embrace passivity, too clear-headed to mistake self-abnegation for humility. You envied the nuns who started their own orders and rules as a way to take control of their spiritual genius, but your good, shrewd mind prevented you from imagining that you could convince yourself of the sanity of the Church's attenuated stance against women simply by reading all the centuries of misogynistic literature. Instead, you became the equivalent of a lay nun, devoted to work among the poor. My parents were pitied because you were so very beautiful. Beautiful women are meant to marry. That Jesus tapped you in the shoulder and asked you to follow him was considered a terrible waste, not to mention tasteless. Is it awful of me to think that illness suited you? I did think that. You were finally able to simply read and pray all day long. You were on the equivalent of a honeymoon and besotted. I sat by your bed while you were in your ecstasies and asked what you heard, thought, saw, and I wrote it all down. Your insights struck me as being at the highest level of purity and truth. It's a quality of truth that is recognizable even if it's alien to one's own experience. You said an ant had as much value as a man, that nature was non-hierarchical, a truth that God had misunderstood in his early works. There was only one soul that showed itself in different forms, including the oblivion beyond the outer cosmos. Prayer isn't necessary. Prayer can come in between God and the truth. Nothing is necessary. All already happened, all is present, and that is all. You saw the blazing lights that mystics see, but you could have done without the pyrotechnics. Based on the dictation I took or you spoke, you came to accept that you really were a mystic, and I accepted it too. You died in summer with our parents and me present. Your last words were harvest moon. After saying that, you let your face go into death. I thought you'd have a smile joining God, but your joy wasn't the stuff of deathbed scenes. We had a box delivered and a grave dug. Mourners dotted our property and the Hancocks. At your memorial service in Philadelphia, so many people came. They lined the streets, and we walked along as if it were a royal reception. Our mother had a heart attack. She was at the Cosmopolitan Club for lunch in the middle of the full-blown moment of cutlery clinking and perfume and powder wafting and ladies gathering information when she tipped to her side in the chair and went unconscious. She was taken to the University of Pennsylvania hospital where they managed to revive her, a mistake. She didn't want to live after Edmund died and never got well again. A year later, she had the stroke that killed her. I wasn't sad when she died, except in a general way. Self-pity, I supposed. Is that not sometimes justified, though? Grace Brown Lee, a person of her class, a person whose habits and manners stamped out the development of desire and predilection in her children, a person who'd done exactly as she was meant to every day of her life, with the exception of one episode, the time of her mourning after Edmund's death. I looked over at my audience. Nan had fallen beautifully asleep with her hands laced on top of her rounded belly. Our chocolate would have to wait a bit longer. There was one story left to tell, the hardest one. Daddy had only been dead for 5 months. I'm in the middle of a shift from being pinioned by his illness and its rage and the beginnings of remembering him as I mainly knew him all my life. He is gone, but coming back to me now, neither a memory yet nor a presence. Oh, my father, Lachlan Lee of the sanguine personality, the brightly applied intelligence, a person born into privilege at a time in history when the world changed dramatically. He saw the advent of the automobile, the airplane, the turn of the century, the wars. He didn't go to any of them as a soldier, but worked hard to offer Quaker support to the wounded and the displaced. He never questioned the ideal of pacifism. He practiced mild manners and deflected conflict when it came his way. His general attitude was one of amusement and curiosity. Over time, I understood that those weren't wholly natural traits, but the result of choice and discipline. The stories of him as a boy featured other traits, such as temper and competitiveness. He let those go to be a light in the world. He encouraged us to use our minds freely. I knew no other father of any girl at school who took her ideas as seriously as Lachlan took ours. He gave us no sense, at least not when we were children, that he saw limits for us or that he considered himself smarter than us. We were brilliant as far as he was concerned, and he spent a lot of time with us asking what we thought about this or that. I know people wonder if Daddy's attention, the way he treated us as interesting, had something to do with why neither you or I married. It's a funny speculation, isn't it, that our minds may have been too well respected by a man. I've often wondered why I survived out of the whole family. Yet I know the answer. It's luck. Luck is a greater factor than anyone who succeeds ever wants to believe. The idea that one is destined to be the person who remains standing, the person smart enough to make all the money, to retain the beauty, is far more seductive. If there's good luck, there's bad luck. That's a reality no one wants to contemplate, but it is reality. I'm merely lucky to be alive. Mrs. Circumstance came in with cups of hot chocolate, and I jiggled Nan. She rubbed her eyes with circled fists. When she saw me, she smiled. The thrill of that is astounding to me. Is this how our mother felt about Edmund? You were asleep, I told her. You were sound asleep, a long winter's nap. She looked around, drawing herself back into the world. It's time for us to have our chocolate, and then I'll take you home. She nodded. I ran my hand brusquely over her hair and smoothed it down. No matter that her father let her dress and groom like a wild animal, that would not happen in my house. A long winter's nap, like a little bear. Shall we? I pointed to the cups, but she got up and trotted to the middle of the room, to the table where the family picture sat. She pointed to Edmund, Elspeth, Mother, and Daddy. Dutifully, I looked at each of them. Then she began again, pointing to Edmund. Edmund, she said, pointing to Elspeth, pointing to Mother, pointing to Daddy, Daddy. Yes, 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 I said, and she went through the game again. After the second time, she looked at me. Annis. Agnes, I said. She struggled with her tongue, and we repeated the name until she could say it. My name, Agnes. Agnes. Agnes, she said. I wish I had a better name for her to learn, but she didn't know the difference. I wanted to point to everything then, tell her the word for each item in the room, in the world. More, emotions, ideas, all of it. All the whole language could offer. But I limited myself to the cups and spoons, enough for one day. Come on, Nan, let me get you home. We left the house. The last of the gold sun gave the impression of warmth, and I didn't feel the October chill till we were halfway across the meadow. I had the same sense of purpose as I had when caring for the family, a straight, strong bearing, loose-limbed and capable, a pioneer woman with substantial skills. A lamp shone from the window of the cabin, a compass point, and it was a moment before I realized I'd lost her. I turned around, and there she stood, fixed to the ground like a tree, waving rhythmically. Robert, she called. No hesitation. Robert. He stood a few dozen feet away and waved at us. Does love begin at 3? It has for Nan. I saw it in the way she turned entirely toward him, body and soul. So, sister, a child has spoken the names of the dead today. Tonight they're all back with me. Perhaps you are among them. I hear their night sounds, their footfalls, their doors closing, and the creak of their mattresses, the creak of their mattress springs. I'm closing my notebook, turning out my light, falling asleep among them. Thank you.
Oh, that was a beautiful reading. It's terrific. Can you start by telling us your process for writing Fellowship Point, how long it took, about how many drafts? There's sort of several stories. For those of you who haven't read it, there are several stories. There are almost several books within the book. Did you do them separately? Did you do it chronologically? How did it come to be for
It
you?
was a very unruly process. I wish it had been chronological, but I started in 2011 when I was at a residency, and the character of Virgil, who's the father of the little girl, was the first character who came to me. And I just started writing about him. He's different than he is now, but I wrote a couple of 100 pages about him, and he just wound up in Maine. And then Polly came, and then Robert came, and then Agnes came. So each of the characters came. I still didn't
in a separate period.
Yeah, I mean, I knew it was all one thing. I knew right away. Even when I first started with Virgil, I knew it was a book. I could feel it because it felt like suddenly I had broken into a place of imagination, and that I just had to be patient, and everything else would come. So, a few things happened along the way. One was that I watched a miniseries called He Knew He Was Right, which was based on a novel by Anthony Trollope. And I thought, I love these 19th century novels. Yeah. I love the twists, the turns, the plots, the subplots, everything that happens in those kind of books. And maybe I'll try and do one of those, which was a kind of a crazy thought, but I thought it would be really fun to try and to learn. I really love how those books have subplots that intersected the plot at a certain point that changes the direction of the book, and it's really powerful. And so I decided to do that. And then another thing that happened was a close friend of mine who lives in Northern California had worked in land trusts all her life, and she was working for University of California, actually, cataloging all the land that had ever been given to University of California, which is not in a database at that time. And she told me that a lot of the land had been given by women. They would inherit these ranches, these old ranches that had passed down.
So interesting.
Yeah, that had passed down, and then they would give it to the University of California. They give it to she also had worked in land trust, so she said the same thing happened in land trust. So I started doing research about this, and the amount of national parks that had actually been started by women but have men's names attached more famously to the founding of the park. And there was just this big history of women donating
So
land.
interesting.
Yeah, I found it fascinating. Then I started studying about, ownership of land by women in this country and what the laws were pertaining to it. So all of that gave me the idea of having a land plot at the center of the story. And it's hard to say how many drafts, because some things I think I wrote once and didn't ever go right again, and some things I wrote several times.
You said you started the Virgil part at a writer's colony. How is that kind of writing different from you than your everyday writing, say when you're teaching? And
so different. I mean, just being I did most of this book, the really important parts of this book, at different residencies when I just had time, because I'm very distractible, and if I'm at a writer's colony, I'm really pretty alone for 23 hours a day, except for dinner.
how often do you go, and how long do you stay?
I think the most I've ever gone is 6 weeks. I usually go for 3 weeks. But out of 24 hours under those circumstances, I probably get a very good 3 hours, with my distractibility level. And in my daily life, I do my best. I mean, I definitely touch it every day. And on the weekends, I would do more. But
Do you feel like you could, if you actually, let's say you'd gone to a place for a year, I mean, do you feel that your imagination, though, was probably building some of this up in the times where you couldn't work as intensely?
I think so. There were a few semesters where I was so busy I didn't touch it at all. I would write, but not on this. And I would have made notes the last time I was working on it. I go back and look at the notes, and it was as if they were in a different language. Because, you get into such a deep place when you're working on something, and then the notes I was making were from that place. So they made no sense coming back, just in a daily mind. So I've learned to make better notes.
I was so interested. It was very cool the way you sort of. I was reminded of the sister and her religion, and Agnes, and then Polly is so different. I mean, they each had such very different lives, and quite cordoned off in a way. I mean, they were almost romantic figures in a way, I thought.
There's another character called Polly, who's Agnes's best friend. They've grown up living next door to each other. I don't know how many of you have read the book, but she's also, there's 3 main characters, Polly, Agnes, and a young woman named Maud. But it's, I like the way you use the word romantic, because I felt that they were heroines in my mind.
They did feel like romantic figures. I mean, there's always Edmund White says that all fiction is sort of generated by 2 Freudian impulses. The wish fulfillment impulse, which you see really goes wild in, say, romance novels and stuff, or the repetition compulsion, which is Kafka,
Right.
or the more realistic grinding. And you feel like it's an interesting balance, because I feel in this novel more than your other work, there's a little more romance.
There is, because I think it's more imaginative than my other work. I think my earlier work had some connection to something to do with my life or someone I knew or something. This one I made up completely. And I think that allowed me to be a little more broad. I think, if it's something closer to me, I'm self-conscious about doing it that way. But this was just free, so.
And how about your next book?
How about my next book? Well, my next book is a continuation. Well, I say continuation, not really a continuation, but I wrote a story called In the Gloaming, which was about a young man dying of AIDS and his relationship with his mother at the end of his life. So the book I'm working on is his family and friends after his death over the next 35 years, but mainly his sister. Because when I first started the story, the sister was the main character, the point of view character. And by the time I finished the story, she has one line. I mean, she doesn't even have a line. She has a walk-on. She comes over to visit, and we just never see her. And
We feel we know her. We know she's companionable.
yes, I've sort of kept writing about those characters all the time and writing more about her and thinking about her. And so that's what I'm working on. What happens to a family after someone who's really as vibrant and amazing as that young man was? How do people go on? And I think that's something that so many of us have to do in our lives. And and I started working on it a while ago, and then my own brother died. And I didn't even realize, someone said to me, "Oh, you're writing because Malcolm died." And I said, "Oh, I didn't even think of that."
That's funny.
Yeah.
Did you you started it before Malcolm
I
died.
did. I started before he was even sick, but it's funny how things work that way with writing. I'm sure you have similar experiences where things don't happen in linear time somehow.
Do you see stories in your future, or are you? No?
Yes. I'm interested in writing novels now, and I have a few ideas, but I have a bunch of stories that I'm pick up, put down, pick up, put down. So we'll see. Not in any hurry.
Tell us about the experience of having a big novel like this. Has it been a good experience, and has it been?
Yeah,
Have you heard from a lot of people?
it's been a very interesting experience because honestly, this book felt very quirky to me. Like you said, two old women and Quakers and Maine, and there were lots about it that I just felt
native land, all that.
I just didn't know. Yeah, I just didn't know if anyone would like this book at all, and people have really liked it. I mean, a lot of men have written me letters. I didn't know if men would like it because it's a very heavily female-oriented book in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's been a really good experience to have people sharing their own experiences with me that they've related to about the book. And especially, I've heard from a lot of women in their 80s who feel...
That's so great.
Yeah. Who really feel like...
It's sort of unrepresented. No, my mother said this once, that there was an issue of Vogue magazine, and it was sort of the 20s. They had like sections. It was the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and then it stopped. It literally stopped. And she was like, "Where's my section?"
Yeah.
And we read for much more than to see ourselves, but we all want to see our time of life and our struggles too.
Well, that came as a surprise to me because I thought of them as, from my perspective, characters. They're characters.
Well, they
I
are.
didn't think of them as being identity figures for a certain group of people, but as it turned out,
Right.
so many people have said, so many older men and women, but mostly women, have written about just being so relieved that they weren't portrayed as old, that they were portrayed as being physically vital in their lives, changing, growing, having important things happen, and doing important things, all of that. And that was what I really cared about that as something I wanted to write about, because I've always loved old women and have always been...
Well, and when one thinks of your characters, one thinks of Polly as this great mother and wife, and she's breaking into her life as a philosopher, and you think of Agnes as the writer, and they each have and then there's the young editor, but you don't think of the old women as old first. You know what I mean? They are old, but they are also old.
Yeah,
it
and
feels.
I think there's you see a lot of them when they were younger too. So, and that was fun too, to think about the possibility of writing characters where you have the whole arc of their lives. They have a lot to draw on when they're thinking about making decisions and things. Yeah.
Well, it's nice too because it seemed, I was just so pleased to see a big, ample 19th century like novel, because people do love to, I love an immersive read, and it just seemed that so many novels were getting smaller and smaller and more elliptical, which can be thrilling too, but it's a different experience, and it's great to have
Yeah.
a big, demanding, immersive novel.
Well, thanks. I do love those books, and it just takes a lot of work to do it. I mean, this one is not going to be like that.
Trollope was fast.
I don't know how he did it.
I don't know how he did it either,
It's
or Dickens.
kind of miraculous.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Well, your books are, most of them, big and immersive.
Most of them are long, not this long, but longer than shorter. So you were saying, did your style change, do you think? I think your style did change a little bit.
I think what I said earlier.
What you said earlier about you weren't afraid to tell rather than show.
Oh,
was
that's
interesting.
true. That's true. Yeah,
Sort of a modern. It's sort of a modern. Our generation was raised with the idea that you have to show or not tell, which means that short stories became almost, in some ways, almost like little theater pieces, like
Yeah.
little plays.
Well, I think that, I think what I realized along those lines is that what keeps me in a book or any project is setting. I just love to think about the environment, and this, just getting up and going to Fellowship Point every morning in my imagination and writing a lot about Maine and writing a lot about the setting, and that is telling. But I do think it's usually done through the sensibility of one of the characters that, it's describing the landscape, but as Polly would see it on that particular day, because of the mood she's in or what's just happened to her. So it's characterization, but it's through writing about the setting. And I think I did give myself permission to do much more of that in this book.
Have you spent a lot of time in Maine, or did you do this as research?
I've been going there since I was 10, I guess. Yeah, we go every summer.
The same spot?
Sort of. I mean, the same island, Mount Desert Island. My mother had a house there. We sold it a few years ago, stupidly, but that happens sometimes. And so my husband and I go to another town there. We've been renting the same house for a long time. Even when we had the other house, we rented our own space. Yeah, and I love it there so much. It's very, very exceptionally beautiful.
So you had that already. You had that geography.
Yes, I did.
And where's in the Gloaming is set in?
Outside Philadelphia. This has a lot of Philadelphia in
It does have
too.
a lot. I like
Yeah.
the Philadelphia too.
Yeah.
I didn't know much about Philadelphia society.
Well, if you keep reading my books, you'll find out more. It's coming in again.
I could go on and on, but I know the audience has questions too. So I'll let you join. Does someone have a question to start with?
Yes.
Can we get you, excuse me, we'll bring you a mic because we record these events, so thank you.
I read a review of your book, and then I had to read it because both my friend and I write children's books. I'm from Philadelphia. And I'm not that far in age from the characters, so there was a lot there. And Polly had three sons, okay, and I have 3 sons. But one thing that drove me crazy was her husband. I was, kind of happy when he went off the stage and Polly could emerge. He just made me so angry. But I loved the book, and I
Thank
loved
you.
being immersed in it. And I recommended it to so many people and bought it for several friends. So brava, and I loved it.
Well, that's so nice. Thank you so much. And I know Dick is a little bit infuriating.
He infuriated me.
He infuriates Agnes, too. She can't
No.
even she can't be nice about him. She tries, but she really
I
can't.
know.
I had a lot of compassion for him because, his big book, The Pacifist Primer, it was just really bad timing that he wrote it right before World War II, and no one wanted to hear anything about pacifism, and he didn't ever overcome that and think of another project. So I felt sorry for him, but yes, definitely a certain type.
Yes, well, he lied about the dog too, and I love animals.
He did.
Didn't he
Oh
feel?
my
Did he?
God.
Did he felt realistic though, even though. Yes, even though.
Well, I think, yes, I think he was having, he was starting to have a little dementia, and I think he might have thought he did call about the dog, but he didn't call about the dog.
I thought he just did.
Well, it could be that, too.
Nice to know that maybe he thought about it.
Yes.
We've already spoken, and I told you how much I liked the book, and I read
Thank
it
you.
in Maine this summer, not so far from where it takes place. Loved everything about it. There could have been more, and I understand there was at one point.
Oh
What
my
was
gosh,
what
there's
was
so
the
many-
process of cutting, and
Yeah.
what was
And what
involved
got
in
lost? That's an interesting
So
question.
much. I mean, I wrote so much more, but when I first turned it in, it was 800 pages. That was having cut a lot. So yes, there's the story of everybody is in my computer somewhere. But what I mainly cut at the last for, to make it into this shape was the first chapter, which was seeing Agnes and Polly when they were 14, and the scene when they see Ham Loose shoot a bird, and they decide they're going to protect that land. But it's also just a vision of them in their houses when they're young and with waking up in the morning with their fathers. And I really had fun writing that. I could have written about them as teenagers for a long time. Then there were also 4 sections of the book that were from male points of view. 4 of the men had their own say and take on it.
Which 4?
Dick, Robert, Virgil, and Polly's youngest son, Theo. They each had their own chapter. And I tried to incorporate it into the book, their way of seeing it, but some people have said it's a little hard on the men. And I don't know if having them there would have made it seem less hard or not. I think maybe, but I don't know, I think it's not too bad. There's a couple of things I wish I hadn't cut, which were when Nan, well, maybe I shouldn't tell, but there was more of Nan when she's a teenager. We hear more about her story. And then we also hear more about Robert's when he I don't want to ruin it if anybody hasn't read it, but he doesn't fight very hard for himself at a very important moment of the book. Yeah. Well, I had more about why he didn't fight for himself.
What was your thinking
more.
making these cuts?
That really, it had a lot to do with his relationship with Agnes. And he knew that if he got into a big defense situation that she would end up paying for the whole thing again. She had already done that once. He didn't want her to do that. And he also felt, the part that got cut was he was married, and he's unmarried now, but he was married, and his wife was testified. She said she was going to testify against him it was a little soapy, but it kind of made sense when it was all written out. But I do think that's a little bit of a hole in the book, like why he didn't. It's a little too passive because he isn't really. You agree? Yes. Yes.
But it's a perfect book.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Jody.
This book was one of those, it was so long, and I kept thinking, looking at it before I started it that I'm going to have to wait like a minute before I start it, but I didn't, and then I've spent too many hours awake. I really lost sleep because not only could I not stop reading, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. But what you just were talking about in the stuff that you cut, it intrigued me, because everything you talked about that you cut, the teenage, the adolescence, more about Nan, that what would it be like, and I don't know if I've ever seen this, to take all of those scenes and make separate stories out of them as some sort of subtext of the novel?
Well, I have thought about that. I have thought about it. I mean, I do have all this material, and I have thought about it. I'm not sure what it would be like, but I have thought of it. We'll see. Maybe it'll happen. Just like just like in the Gloaming characters, I've been still writing about them. Maybe that's going to happen with this as well.
I'd love to see it.
So one of the things that always fascinates me about writing is how you balance the power and the uniqueness of your own individual vision with wisdom and feedback from others. So do you have maybe one example, two examples, it doesn't have to be from Fellowship Point, of an instance when you got feedback and you didn't take it, and versus an instance when you got feedback and you did?
Oh, that's really interesting.
Well, I mean, I took feedback on this book from my agent and my editor at the final stages when I cut those 4 male chapters. That was really a long conversation with my editor. 800 pages is too long. We can't publish a book this long. How can we cut into this book without maiming the book too much? And that seemed like a possibility. So I thought that was a very straightforward cut, and it was good to have outside perspective on that. When I haven't taken suggestions, 90% of the time, I just feel like I think the way I respond, and I appreciate my students do this a lot too, is people make very specific suggestions, and I understand, okay, there's something wrong there, but their solution is not going to be my solution. But I sort of take the point like, okay, there's around here the energy is not working, so go look at that spot. And my agent's wife, I have to say, she's so wonderful. She's really brilliant, and she reads my stuff, and she'll just say, now, when Polly ... And I'm like, got it, I'll fix that. It's like
so great.
I know, I love that. And actually, I mean, my husband's a great reader, and he reads, and he's very judicious about his suggestions because we're married, and our marriage is important to us. So, but I have to say my son is a brilliant reader, and he gives me a lot of editorial. So,
Is he less judicious?
yes, totally. We're pretty straightforward with each other.
There's another question there. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate the fact that out of all the things you didn't cut, that you included the part of the tomato soup and the grilled cheese. I thought that was a really nice touch in the excerpt. It's always nice to focus on the food. But no, seriously though, you mentioned how in this novel specifically you kind of veered away from it being as personal, and it gave you a lot more freedom because you were kind of being more creative with the characters you had. So my question wasn't so much about the creativity you had, but when you're dealing with more stuff about yourself and people we get inspiration from people we know and stuff. Is there ever an instance where you're this is like way too similar to somebody I know, and I kind of like need to tone it down a bit otherwise, or do you just go ahead with it? And, you know.
I used to go ahead with it, and I'm not doing that anymore. You know, I think what can happen is you lose track, you know, because you do apply your imagination to whatever you write. So you can lose track of how much it actually is like reality. That's happened to me a couple of times, and I don't want that to happen again, where I look back and I'm like, oh, that's a little too close to that person's actual life. And I wrote one story in the past where I had two friends, and they each said to me, two male friends, they each said, this is really great, but what's he going to say when he reads it? You know, they both thought it was about the other one, which I thought was really funny. Because I guess to me it was sort of a composite character, or neither of them. But I like writing now just really made up characters. I don't know. We'll see. Life is, I hope, long, and maybe things will change again. There's one there. Oh.
Yeah, hello again.
Hi.
On the topic of characters, I think when you talk about your characters, it seems almost that you know them so intimately, like they're your best friends. And so I guess my question would be, is there any character throughout your history of writing that you particularly connect with, or that you're very proud that you wrote that character? And just, can you talk about that experience of writing something and then realizing, I feel very passionate, connected, or I love that specific character?
I loved all the three main characters in this book, Agnes, Polly, and Maud. Agnes was a surprise to me. She came later in the process. But I really, you know, I was kind of astonished by aspects of her personality, and I kind of gave her the writing life I wish I had, which was fun. And Polly, who is basically what we used to call a housewife, I'm not sure what the current term is, but she's someone who has done her major work in the home with raising children and making life beautiful for those around her. I really love how I got her on the page, because I wanted to valorize that kind of life, which I think has lost some of its sheen. And I think it's a perfectly noble way to live. So I was proud of that. Maud is my students. You know, it's a different generation than how I grew up. A young woman much more assertive than I was, or was even welcome to be. You know, life has changed a lot for young people in terms of wanting more now, instead of working your way up and finally maybe getting a job you like when you're 55. It's changed. And I really like that. I like how people feel like they want more quality of life. So she was that for me. So all of them. But they all came to me. They came to me fully formed, and I just had to, you know, it was just a process of learning more about them when they were in rooms together. But I didn't, you know, I never wrote like character lists, like their pet is name. I didn't do any of that. They just came to me.
I have another question. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, this is a question really for both of you. I wonder if you could comment on the interaction between teaching writing and actually writing. Do they enhance each other? Do they deplete each other? Does it stimulate you, or do you feel at the end of the day like you're done with talking about writing and not ready to attack it again?
You know, it's funny. There's a writer I've known for years who always says, and she's actually a very, very beloved teacher, she always says, I have to make it work for me. And I think that that's hard to do, but I think it's true. I don't find teaching to get in the way of writing. I enjoy teaching, but then I don't teach a whole lot. But what I do find sometimes, I think the university life, which can sometimes involve committees and meetings and a lot of that I find less close to the core. So that can get in the way, I think. What do you think?
I found that, I guess when I first started teaching and I was thinking about other people's work so much and so deeply, it was editorial. And then I would go back to my own writing, and I wasn't at that state. I would look at my writing much too harshly because I wasn't ready to think about it at that stage. Now that doesn't bother me anymore. I've been able to make that separation. I would say that though I wish I had more hours to myself, having had 20 plus years now of having the opportunity to talk to other people just straight up about writing has been amazing, because I've had to figure out how to explain things, and I think that makes a huge difference. What is a plot? How does it work? Why does it work that way? How can I make a plot my own? I don't want to do the same old thing that's been. I want something new. How to talk about that, how to explain those things. If I were just doing it without having to explain it, I'm not sure I would have gotten as far with understanding a lot about writing and craft as I have done, with the fact that I really want to be able to tell my students valuable things, valuable things. So in aggregate, I think it's been a great experience, but it's not always easy. As Mona said, there's a lot about it that's difficult, but it is wonderful to be with people who are learning to write and really want to.
And I'm sure, do you give them stories? Like, do you give them,
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
And I mean, when you think of it, we're all readers in this room, but I bet we've all read, I bet we could, if we chose to take a poll, I bet we could find 5 to 10 books that everyone in this room has read. And yet, some of you have read them some of you have read War and Peace last week, some of you have read it 10 years ago, some of you, read it more than that. And it's really a kind of privilege to assign a story, have kids read it 3 times, you read it very closely, and all of you talk about that story in a really present, deep way, because you've just read it. You're all really in it. And you don't get that experience that much in regular adult life.
I find it's very hard. I'm in a good book group. I don't know but it's not the same.
No, it's not the same. That's true. So there is something special about
I
it.
love that too. And I love teaching the same stories over. I teach Lawns over and over, Mona's brilliant story. I love teaching these stories over and over because I see things new every time that I never saw before, which is, it takes me by surprise every time.
I remember you had another question, too.
Thank you. When you were talking about you don't make character lists, I realized that I do want to know more about your process. When you sit down to write on a Tuesday, do you read over what you might have written on the Monday before, and then do you make revisions as you go along? What gets you back into the characters and the stories? Do you outline? How do you keep track of who's where and what encounters have occurred? That's what I'm really wondering about.
I do. That's so many questions. I do outline later, not at first. At first I just write. I outline later, but then I don't refer to it's like outlining is almost reminding myself what I did. I don't go back and look at the outline. The one thing I do is I have like a list of when everyone was born, what year they were born, because I need to keep the names straight. I get up in the morning early, It gets earlier and earlier. Now it's about 4:30.
That's
And
very early.
I know, it's early. And then I spend about an hour doing all the things you're not supposed to do, like Wordle, email, I warm up. And then it's about 5:30. And then I start writing, and I don't know. I mean, I try to think a little bit about what I want to do today, but not that much. I just kind of go back in and pick up where I left off. I don't reread what I wrote the day before. I just go back in, and I write for as long as I can. And as soon as I find myself starting to think, I'm like, stop right now. Because then I start, it's not good. I just try and write naturally, whatever comes. Which doesn't mean I'm not thinking. Of course I'm thinking. But there's a certain way that when I can tell when I start to think too much. And that means I'm tired. My mind is tired. It's not just flowing. So I stop. I don't push myself past that. If I have more time, I go back and do that same routine again. But I don't push past. It's usually somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes.
So it's now like 7 a.m. when you finish.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
It's kind of fabulous. You have the whole day. More questions?
Did you have one? Yeah.
I love Fellowship Point,
Thank
as
you.
I've told you. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Agnes's writing career as it relates to your own, and especially I'm interested in the pseudonym plot.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever written anything with a pseudonym, but it seems important
No, but I
somehow.
always wanted to. I mean, that was always a fantasy of mine growing up, is to write pseudonymously. And it was interesting when I started creating her. I mean, when she's just started appearing, and it's exactly like it said in the book. She turned her first book in, and her editor just said, "You're never going to be able to show your face in Philadelphia again." And that shocked her and I think this is very shocking to a lot of writers, is, you're working alone, and you feel this sense of privacy and protection, and then it's out in the world, and then people have strong reactions to what people write. People get in real trouble this way, especially with memoir. They don't exactly understand what's going to happen. But right when I was working on that, then Elena Ferrante came along, and I was like, oh, this is so great. I can watch this actually unfold in real time. I think Agnes, I love the books that she writes. I love her children's book series. I hope someone will let me do that series. I love her Franklin Square books. I wish I had done that starting when I was 25 and, done a series about the same women every 10 years. I love that idea. So it's basically a lot of ideas I wished I had done. Yeah.
You could. That would be fun, actually.
I know.
That would be a cool way to do it.
I think so.
Sequel to this book.
I think so. Yeah, it was fun to think about her, 5 hours a day, because I used to do more like that. As I say, I really am much more intuitive about when I feel my mind starting to get tired. I used to push it in terms of word count, hours, but I find that I get more done this way, surprisingly, because it's just kind of good, fresh stuff, and then it's not getting into more areas where I have to cut it all.
Well, that's a good time of day because no one's going to interrupt you at 4:30.
Exactly.
Okay. Alice has generously agreed. I think you agreed. Will you sign some books?
Of course.
Okay, great. So
Of course.
we'll continue on, and the Hammer's always very generous about having lovely coffee, tea, and cookies. So we can form a line outside. There's a table for signing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.